atheist is reaching a fever pitch. Some seek to find common understanding and agreement. This is a place where we begin with differences and end with similarities. This is Apologia.
All right, hello and welcome to Apologia. My name is Zachary Moore and I'll be moderating the discussion today. Joining me is a group of theists and atheists who are here for a friendly roundtable discussion about their different perspectives and where they can find agreement. If you happen to have feedback for the discussion, you can give it at the website for this podcast, which is hosted at drzach.net. Today we have, representing atheism, James Lazarus and Ryan Cunningham. Laz is the author of Theism and Gambling, a critique of pragmatic arguments for belief in God. Ryan is active in the skeptical movement and studies computer science at the master's level at the University of Central Florida. Representing theism, we have Kevin Harris. Kevin is the Minister of Apologetics at the First Baptist Church in Colleyville, Texas. Gentlemen, welcome to the discussion.
Thank you.
All right, well, so far on this podcast series, we've talked about faith, evidence, and knowledge. Now, I want to turn to another area that takes into account everything that we've been touching on already, science. Throughout the progression of human history, the relationship between science and religion has changed dramatically. In the days of Pythagoras, science was an enterprise considered to be completely in line with the concept of gods and the divine, a way to rigorously and elegantly describe the nature of a divine creation. However, in the time of Galileo, science was first placed in the spotlight not for its illumination of the divine plan, but for its contradiction of the divine scriptures. Since that time, the discoveries of science have consistently been built into a corpus of knowledge that is, with a significant degree of frequency, perceived by many religious people as contrary to their beliefs. I'm kind of reminded of the Simpsons episode, which featured Stephen Jay Gould as a guest star, in which a judge commanded that religion and science had to stay away from each other. Gould himself had something similar to say about the two. He talked about science and religion occupying non-overlapping magisteria. In other words, science and religion have different tasks and answer different questions about reality. However, other scientists, like Richard Dawkins, think that science's answers supersede those of religion, and that religion is only valuable as something to be studied, perhaps as a sociological curiosity. Still others, like Carl Sagan and his widow Anne Droyan, thought of science as a replacement for religion, and viewed scientific discoveries with the same kind of mystical wonder that religious believers experience about their faith. So, the questions on the table now are, what is science really? How do we approach what we think of as science? Does science inform religion, or does religion inform science? And what happens when religion and science contradict each other? How do we determine which is right? Now, Ryan, you're pretty active in the skeptical movement, and you've got a pretty strong background in scientific thought. Can you give us a brief explanation of what science is from a secular perspective and what it means?
I would say the lead up in the show so far that we've done, evidence and knowledge, discussing those two things specifically, science tries to incorporate all of the evidence that we have found so far through experimentation and other observation into a body of knowledge that summarizes into theories that evidence. So we seek concise descriptions of that evidence. So the whole Occam's razor principle comes into play. We seek to explain as much evidence as possible, so it has to be consistent with all of the evidence we see, and it has to be mathematically precise. So we gain knowledge by sort of incrementally testing hypotheses, testing them through experimentation to get evidence to basically try and break our current understanding of the world or reinforce our current understanding of the world.
Okay.
That would be my off-the-cuff definition of science.
Okay. Kevin, I wonder if you could, from a religious perspective, is that basically how you see science also? Is there anything else that you can add to it, being a religious person?
I don't think so. I think that's a real good definition. I think there's probably pretty much universal agreement on the basics of science. What I would add is what I want to dispel immediately is what you'll often see in interactions like these. It seems like the Christian theist, the Christian apologist will almost always begin pointing out the theist who were the great scientists and how so many of the founders, so-called, of science, and some of the great foundational guys in science were theists, Christian theists, deists, and so on. But I think that is beside the point. It would just be the genetic fallacy to say, well, all these guys were theists, therefore there's no conflict with science and religion. Because it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Should definitely point out that atheists do the same thing.
Yeah,
right now,
I think so too.
The American Association of Scientists, so many atheists on it, and et cetera. Both sides are guilty of that, absolutely.
Yeah, and we do, and we just try to win some rhetorical points, I guess, doing that. And while that may be interesting from a current standpoint and from a historical standpoint in arriving at various definitions, ultimately, it's got any view, any method, any science has got to stand on its own merits, despite how it originated, who originated it, and under what circumstances. And so I think we all agree on that. So I would do that. The second thing that I would point out is that it's very difficult to try to avoid. It's very difficult to avoid. In fact, I don't think you can avoid the fact that all the sciences are undergirded by philosophy, and I've met people who really just don't like that at all. They think that philosophy and science are just so opposite and polar opposites and so on. And what you got to realize is the minute a person says that, a person is given his philosophy of science, and so there is philosophy that undergirds the scientists. That's why you have great philosophers of science like Michael Ruse and others, even Karl Popper, who comment on the scientific method and the hard sciences, science writers and so forth, but also the philosophy that undergirds science. And so I think that's probably two good topics. One, a definition of science, what it is, what it isn't, and secondly, the fact that philosophy, in varying degrees, undergirds the hard sciences.
Right, and maybe Laz, could you give us a brief appraisal of the way that philosophy and science sort of work together and what the foundations are of? I know we've been talking philosophy a lot before on this podcast. Could you just sort of link those two together for us?
Well, actually, it's a bit controversial to say exactly how philosophy and science work together. I like to think of them as sort of having a hand-in-hand relationship. In fact, an epistemologist, Keith Loyer, sort of talks about this, where philosophy is that sort of pot of all filled with all sorts of things that we really can't decide on right now. We really don't know what the solutions to these questions are, but science, something becomes more called science when we're able to empirically investigate it and empirically come to a solution. But the point that he would make is that it's a little bit muddled where exactly something can be called science or scientific question and where exactly it can be called a philosophical question. But really, at the end of the day, I think that philosophy and science both sort of they would help each other. They would progress together, and that's what you might try to see in the philosophy of mind right now. We have cognitive neuroscience making leaps and bounds in their research, and at the same time, the philosophy of mind is also progressing in a lot of arguments and research, and we're coming to very interesting ideas about the nature of the mind. So really, I would like to see philosophy and science sort of helping each other. Philosophy would deal with more abstract considerations, but what philosophy could do is draw on the empirical investigations of science and come to and proceed to abstractly consider the issues. But I think that's one way that you might be able to separate the two. Philosophy deals with abstract considerations, or rather, it considers different issues in an abstract fashion, whereas science will consider it, the basis of scientific consideration would be empirical. That's one way that you might be able to frame the distinction.
Okay.
And maybe that's one way that you could also frame how they help each other.
So science.
Let me just add that just exactly what Laz said, how controversial it is. Bertrand Russell said, "Science is what you know, philosophy is what you don't know." And he was a philosopher, himself, and somewhat of a philosopher of science. But again, when if people just read that quote right there, kind of quote mine that a little bit, they're going to think that they're at odds. But I think Bertrand Russell is just kind of making the same distinction that Laz is.
So
ultimately, I think both of them are looking for the same thing, in that they're both seeking consistency, consistent explanations across empirical evidence, across logical thought, across, sort of trying to come to explanations that are consistent with each other.
Well, they're both trying to explain and give information about the nature of reality.
Right.
Right. It's just that philosophy is more of a metaphysical approach to that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but science, whatever science is, whatever the philosophy of science has to say, ultimately, we can generally agree that science is a systematic way to empirically investigate the nature of reality, and in the attempt to draw some sort of conclusion, about what reality is. Correct?
Empirical seems to be the key word.
Right. Right. And the obvious question now is that really the way that religion works? I mean, is science really diametrically opposed to? I mean, are they really opposites? As sort of the popular consensus seems to suggest that science and religion are completely at odds. In that Simpsons episode, I mentioned that there was a restraining order, and science was not allowed to come within so many feet of religion. Is that really the way things are? Can science and religion not play in the same room?
I don't agree with that. I think that it obviously depends on what type of religion that you're going to hold to. For instance, if you're a Christian fundamentalist who believes that the world is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and that man arose spontaneously from a pile of dirt and woman arose from a man's bone, then yes, you are going to have conflicts with contemporary scientific research. But at the same time, there are many believers who hold to many different types of religion that are entirely compatible with contemporary scientific research. So while I do think that religion and science both try to say things about the way that the world really is, I don't think that science and religion have to necessarily conflict.
But they don't necessarily have to, but sometimes they do.
I agree with you, but again, that would depend on the type of religion that you're holding to. For instance, if we took the sort of religious ideas that evolutionary scientist Kenneth Miller holds to, I don't think that his type of Catholicism in any way conflicts with contemporary scientific research. However, if you went on to, say, take a look at Jerry Falwell or Pat Robertson or Kent Hovind, these people hold to religious ideas that conflict with contemporary scientific research, and if you would like to, investigate that deeper, you might also come to the idea that atheists as well can hold to ideas that are against contemporary scientific research. But again, that's really not saying very much, because we don't have to, just like a person who believes in a particular religion does not have to.
Okay. But is it, I'm wondering, because it seems like religion or science is more unyielding than religion.
I think that. Go ahead.
No, go.
I was just going to say, I think the man on the street, Dr. Zach, like what you're talking about, thinks that there is a conflict. I think your average person thinks that there is. I think it's only those who are really, involved in the study and are informed can realize where there can be integration, where there is conflict, where they're not necessarily in conflict, and so on. But for instance, my son Cody's in the 5th grade, and he was talking to a classmate of his, and they got on the subject of God, and she says, "I don't believe in God, I believe in science." And now we could stop there and say, that seems to be a typical maybe approach that it's one or the other. It's either or. It's not both. It can't be both and. But what's funny is that he, after pressing a little bit and talking to her some more, he asked her, who created everything and so on, the typical stuff kids talk about, and she said, "Science did. Science created everything."
Yeah, see that's
she's taking it one a little far, but at the same time, and again, that's a 12-year-old girl.
Sure.
But I do think, just anecdotally, that people tend to think that there is a barrier that the two cannot be crossed.
Well, and that's certainly what Stephen Jay Gould thought. Like I mentioned, he talked about non-overlapping magisteria. He argued that science has its own particular realm of questions that it can answer, and religion has its own realm of questions that it can answer, and the two don't really intersect at all. And but he didn't really seem to think that science could completely replace religion. And this is an idea that's somewhat controversial, because I know that, like I mentioned, Carl Sagan really did see science. He didn't feel like there's any need for religion, because you had science. Science provided you with that sense of wonder. So it kind of was replacing at least the role culturally that religion typically plays in people's lives. So I don't know in terms of the spectrum, Carl Sagan on one hand, Gould on another, and Dawkins on another. What's the best sort of merging of the two? If the two are really going to work together, do they have to work in separate rooms? Does one have to defeat the other, or what? What has to happen?
Well, I think that I'll say very quickly. I think that both Dawkins and Gould are wrong. I think that science and religion are going to end up working in the same room, and I would personally say that if it turns out that a religious perspective conflicted with science, then that religious perspective would have to give way. The Dalai Lama, I read in an article a little while ago, he's very interested in contemporary neuroscience, and the journalist asked him, she said, "Well, Dalai Lama, exactly what are you going to do if the research turned out to conflict with your religious ideas?" And he responded back immediately, and he says, "Well, I guess I would have to change my religious ideas." And I think that that's the healthiest perspective to take. But Stephen Jay Gould felt that that science and religion did operate in different rooms, and I think that that's plainly false. I believe that religious people do believe that they're saying things that apply to the world around us, and I think that Christians, particularly, they have a religion that is rooted in history. They believe that a man literally, or many of them anyway, believe that a man literally rose from the grave about 2,000 years ago. So that is something that history can research. They're not simply dealing with what is morally good or what makes us feel good or mystical. That's what Gould felt that religion did for us, but many religions say so much more. Further, Dawkins feels that that contemporary scientific research conflicts with religious ideas, and I talked about before why I feel that that's wrong. In fact, he went so far to say that evolution, the theory of evolution, made it possible to be an intellectually respectable atheist.
Right.
And many philosophers have had big problems with that, not only believers, but many atheistic and agnostic philosophers as well, have felt that was completely ridiculous for Dawkins to have said that.
So I guess what I'm hearing then is that science informs religion and not the other way around.
When religion is making empirical claims.
Okay. So is that saying that only part of the time they're in the same room and the other part of the time they got to be kept separate depending on what claims are being made?
Yeah, I think that would be a fair thing to say. I think basically when religion makes an empirical claim that goes against contemporary scientific research, then religion must give way to scientific research. That's the position that I would hold to.
So what are your thoughts on that, Kevin? I mean, that certainly does not seem to be something that religious people, at least in American culture, would be too thrilled about.
Well, the difficulty is that everybody wants to claim science to be on their side, and I'm not a young Earth creationist, as anybody who's listened to this podcast have heard. I think that I'll make a prediction right now. I think that young Earth creationism, as far as any kind of having any kind of a platform or any significant voice, will be gone in 20 years. And it's gone before. I mean, young Earth creationism, I don't want to get off on this, but I'll illustrate to make a point. Young Earth creationism is not the view that the church has always held, and a lot of people think that. It's waxed and waned. You have young Earth and old Earth, and some of the great Christian thinkers, even like Augustine, don't think that necessarily that the Earth is 6,000 years old, and so on. But everybody wants to kind of claim science is their friend and on their side. And one of the things I want to key in on is then what happens if they conflict?
Yeah, exactly.
Where is the conflict? What is that point? And like just this week, I was talking to I heard some guy, and I haven't been to Talk Origins or anything right now I've talked to Dr. Zach a little bit about it, but like some of the young Earth creationists were talking about a T-Rex fossil that was found that still had some soft tissue in the fossil, and there's just no way, therefore, they could have been 65 million years old. Oh, yeah. That there was something in the preservative of this fossil that lend the credibility that it was probably maybe just several thousand years old. Now, my first reaction to that was, that's ridiculous, and I don't care what they say. I'm not gonna believe that. But then I thought, no, but wait just a minute. That's not honest. That's ruling out the possibility beforehand before looking at the evidence. Now, some of the stuff that I've read since then has dispelled that. But what if? What if you suddenly found a T-Rex fossil that it still had some softer tissue in it, or tissue to the extent that it couldn't be 65 million years old? That would totally change the way that we look at the age of the dinosaurs and so on, And so that's just one of the things I want to point out. Sometimes we don't like the conclusions that people are arriving at, or that we don't like the conclusions that the evidence may be leading us toward, because we think there's just a better paradigm, or because we have an emotional resistance. So where in fact do they conflict? And is there this war between science and religion historically that has always raged? I don't know if anybody can make too much of a case on that. I think there are just little skirmishes. One thing that I would caution is that the nature of science itself is, and this is a good thing about science, is that it can correct itself. Yeah. And further data and research can bring new light to bear, and so on. And so if we say this scientific discovery overturns a particular religion and so on, fine, well and good, but what if that scientific theory is overturned? Mm-hmm. And, then what are you going to do? So that's one thing I would bring up. Is try to find, I'd like to see and try to crank down and fine-tune just where the conflicts are, perhaps, and then and see what could be done if that's the case.
Well, you don't even have to go to creationism. The Mormons tend to make pretty specific claims about things that are on a pretty regular basis contradicted by science. In fact, one of the
absolutely
one of their beliefs is that the Native Americans, the Aboriginal Americans, were actually descended from ancient Hebrews. And I think it wasn't too long ago, I think it was fairly recently, that they did some, it was in the light of the Human Genome Project, and they were mapping out different cultures and showed pretty clearly that Native Americans, in fact, did not come from the Middle East, but they migrated from East Asia. And
that was from the Mitochondrial Eve Project, right?
Is that where that was from? I know that was, that was fairly recently, maybe not so recently, but.
Well, as I understand, the Mormons themselves are the ones who have discovered this, and it's caused a lot of controversy at Brigham Young University, in that they have just shown that this view of where the Lamanites, where the American Indians came from, is false. And so I think things like that ought to cause one to question one's theology, the claims of one's worldview, religion, and so on. I think that's legit, and I don't think I just don't think in any way, shape, or form that the Earth is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Mm-hmm. And the Bible doesn't demand that. From the word yom could mean a long period of time. And if it's the case, then we have a God who is deceiving us, who's making it look old, but he actually made it young.
Yeah,
making starlight in mid-flight. Halfway between the star and here.
Yeah.
We're talking about stars with millions of light years away. That means millions of years of traveling to us. We have to throw out a trigonometry and all kinds of things if we didn't accept that. And if we do accept that, and then God really is trying to trick us.
What it leaves the impression of is many people, and again, perhaps we're talking on the lay level, or those who are really involved in the subject on the internet and so on. They see that there is a vigorous and very rigorous body of work among theologians who say no, it could be long periods of time, and progressive creationism. In other words, the universe is 12 to 15 billion years old. And so on. Then you've got deists, and you've got theistic evolutionists like Ken Miller and those. And many people, perhaps secularists, would look at that and go, well, see, they're coming around. Give them a few more time, and they're even going to throw that out. Mm-hmm. And what I would say to that is, well, look, number one, this is perhaps a good integration of theology and science, coming to a consensus on what the empirical evidence tells us, and then what the philosophical evidence or theological evidence would tell us. And second of all, I would point out that young Earth has not always been the paradigm anyway, and so there's not this necessarily a move away from the traditional view to something that's more in keeping with science. It's waxed and waned throughout the last 2,000 years. With some of the, like I said, with some of the big thinkers, thinking that no, it's long periods of time. But so see, I think that progress can be made, and therefore an eclectic view, perhaps, can be integrated into trying to have a more complete worldview. But again, we're back to what Laz says. I think empiricism is the view. Dawkins himself says, science is the disinterested search for the objective truth about the material world. And so we're dealing with empiricism, and we're dealing with the materialism in a healthy majority of science.
Right. So when religion and science contradict each other, for example, within the claims that are put up by Mormons about the ancestry of the Native Americans, religion has to take what science dishes out, basically. And is that good for, like, for example, specifically in this example for the Mormons, is that good for the Mormon faith, or is that bad for the Mormon faith? Does that make it better, or does that weaken it?
Well, I would probably say it depends on what claim you're considering. For instance, if you have a religious paradigm and one of the essential claims of that religion is disproven by science, well then obviously, yes, science spells doom for that religious perspective. But if it's simply just this, small idea that some religious thinker has come up with within that perspective, then it would simply be an improvement. It really doesn't disprove the religion. It just helps it to correct itself, just like science does to itself all the time.
Okay. So I guess moving away from these specific examples, how does the interaction actually take place? Because there is still there seems to be some distrust, some innate distrust among religion for science, and there also seems to be some not distrust but condescension among science for religion. And so I'm wondering.
I think probably the source of so much of this contention. Kevin just quoted Dawkins. I think dispassionate is one very key word there. And Sagan has a lot of great words of advice in the same perspective, that you can't be emotionally attached to the conclusion in science. You have to be ready to say, I was wrong. That's a really neat idea. It was a really beautiful idea. I had a lot invested in it. But if it's wrong, I have to let it go. Empirical evidence shows that it's wrong, and I have to accept that it was wrong. And religious claims typically have a lot of emotional investment. And when they're disproven, I think that's one of the reasons anyone who has an emotional investment in a particular belief or a particular theory, when it's disproven, it breaks your heart. I just working on, genome projects and having ideas, and then I graph it and it doesn't even look like a correlation at all. God, I just wasted a whole week.
Yeah.
It's all wrong.
Yeah.
Very disheartening.
Are religious people, though, prepared to face those, not failures, but prepared to accept the null hypothesis if it comes up? If it comes up that the data shows that the null hypothesis is true, are religious people prepared to accept that? Because I think that may be the one stumbling block. Is this, even when the evidence shows something to the contrary, are they going to accept evidence, or are they going to accept their belief system?
Probably not going to accept the evidence. Probably going to accept their belief system, and I think that many religious people fear science for that very reason. They're afraid that it is going to take away their Linus blanket. They're afraid that it's going to take away that emotional dependence Lance was talking about. And it's almost like you can't handle the truth. You're afraid of the truth. And the way they isolate themselves or insulate themselves from this is by kind of going along with what Dawkins says. Well, we're talking about two different things anyway. This is my belief, and this is the fact. A lot of people leave. That's a crazy way to live, but people tend to live that way. These are my beliefs, and once a week I go and visit them at the Belief Museum. But then the rest of the week I accept fact.
Mm-hmm.
And so the beliefs aren't even factual. They're just something that you hold emotionally, completely subjectively. And so therefore, you can't falsify them or their view in that sense, because they've taken pains to set up an insulation, against that. But it's just a misunderstanding of truth. I mean, if something's true, it's true. And truth shouldn't be, truth dares to be questioned. Why fear the truth,
Right.
But I know that goes on both sides, but you certainly see it in the religious world.
And I guess what bothers me so much personally is leaving so many of those people behind. Is it really, if people are going to are really going to cling to their beliefs over and above whatever science shows about the evidence and what the evidence tells us about reality? Do we really have to leave these people behind?
You know what you could point out to them. Let me just say real quick that in the Christian situation, if you're a Christian, you can point out to the Christian that their own Lord, their own founder, said that, hey, if you can't believe me about earthly things, how are you going to believe me when I talk about heavenly things? In other words, if the more empirically verifiable things that I'm talking about, if you can't believe me on that, then how can you trust me on things that aren't quite as readily empirically verified? If you can't trust me on the mundane things, how are you going to trust me on the things that are extra mundane? And so their own founder himself seems to say that you need to be accurate in both, and that the both can lead to truth, and that both can inform one another, and that there doesn't have to be a conflict.
So, optimally, I guess, what I'm saying is that a religious faith, a religious believer, needs to almost be as ready to adapt his religious hypothesis, his God hypothesis, in the same way that a scientist is willing to adapt his working hypothesis about whatever he's studying. Ultimately, to maintain that intellectual rigor, the same way that a scientist would.
Yeah.
Does that seem reasonable? Okay.
I will say you were very worried about leaving these people behind, Zach.
Mm-hmm.
Being involved in the skeptical movement and having, I think we would all agree that someone who has factual evidence in front of them and refuses to believe it has an irrational belief.
Mm-hmm.
Having dealt with a lot of people with irrational beliefs, almost nothing will change their mind. It's a very difficult thing. I think we shouldn't give up on trying, but the most poignant example I can think of is James Randi with his $1 Million Challenge.
Yeah.
Is constantly testing dowsers, and they claim beforehand, 100% accuracy, and they're so confident in the skill they have, and
dowser, just real quick,
just to the test protocol, they agree to everything.
Just to clarify for our listeners, Ryan, dowsers are what?
There are people who believe that they have all different methods, but they believe that they can most generally find things through some magical power.
Like,
normally it's a forked stick, and they can find water, but
okay.
They claim to find gold and all kinds of things. Sorry.
Water wishers.
Yeah.
And they go and they test this ability, and they fail spectacularly. There's no doubt that they have failed this test. And they believe that they can succeed with 100% accuracy. And they're faced with clinching evidence that they don't have this ability. And they rationalize instantly as soon as the test is over. They say, well, the moon's not in alignment. Well, they're just amazing at coming up with excuses,
right? Rather
than accepting, maybe I was wrong.
Right.
They've invested so much of themselves in this belief. It's very hard to dissuade them.
Well, the Quran says that semen comes from a man's chest, And no amount of apologetic gymnastics can get around that. Semen obviously does not come from a man's chest, and yet the Quran, claims it does. And so there is probably a pretty good example of where Biology 101, reproduction, is going to dispel something that claims to be infallible from God.
So I think we've reached the point at which we're sort of separating, one side from the other. But I want to concentrate now on I'm bringing this back together, especially for those theists out there that are willing to to really think sort of like a scientist in terms of their beliefs. Is there any way that that task can be made easier? Because I know we talked in the past about natural evidence versus supernatural evidence, and that seems to be a theme that crops up very frequently. And I'm reminded of Ken Miller, the author of the book Finding Darwin's God, who actually makes an excellent explanation of evolutionary theory in general for a lay audience. And at the end of the book, he goes into some detail about his own religious beliefs and how he's able to sort of mesh what he believes about God with also what he knows from science. And it ends up being sort of like a theistic evolution approach. And is this a way that theists who have this who have a responsibility to their belief, to their God, which they feel is primary, can they sort of approach scientific contradictions or scientific truths or facts in a way that can mesh with their doctrines by assigning certain things into a supernatural category? Is that something that is acceptable to both science and religion? Does anybody have any thoughts?
I think that should probably be answered by the religious side first.
Kevin, does that sound not to denigrate necessarily the theistic claims, but can you say sort of cast things, or is that just impossible to do? Can you cast things in sort of a supernatural light and say, well, this is true supernaturally, but not necessarily naturally, or is that even an impossible thing to do?
I have trouble with that. I have trouble with it. Well, objectively, this is true, but subjectively, it's not. I just think that kind of blows away the correspondence view of truth.
Well, not necessarily objectively and subjectively. It's supernaturally and naturally because, as we've talked about, science is methodologically naturalistic.
I'll tell you what I think. I think that for empirical things, empirical, concrete as far as material and empirically verifiable, you would utilize forensics to the extent of an observation consistent with what you would look for empirically. But for metaphysical claims, metaphysical theories, metaphysical or supernatural predictions, and so on, you would look at philosophical evidence. I think that you would consider evidence that would be consistent with what would dispel or verify something of a metaphysical nature. And I think that could be done. In other words, if God exists, you're not going to test for him in the same way you would a kitchen appliance or something of a material nature. So is it possible in an integration from Ken Miller and those who want to see some kind of an integration between science or theology, philosophy, and religion, is there a way to just use different kinds of evidence? I know a lot of people who want or who demand empirical evidence for God, and while some of the effects may be empirical and could make predictions and serve as verification and a predictor for the model and the verification for the what the model predicts or what the hypothesis predicts. Really, empiricism and empirical verification is limited. And, it's limited anyway. I mean, the empirical verification is principle, thrown out in the 60s because it couldn't verify itself. You can't empirically verify the empirical verification system, principle. And it's the same way, I don't know who coined the phrase scientism, but scientism tends to be a view that science is the only way to find truth. And something is not true unless it's scientifically verifiable. But it goes the way of the empirical verificationist principle in that you can't scientifically verify that proposition. You can't scientifically verify that only those things which are scientifically verifiable are true. So it kind of fails its own test, self-stultification and so on. So again, I'm kind of back to an eclectic. Obviously, I think there are different kinds of evidence that you would use in order to determine what it is you're looking for.
But for whatever your theistic beliefs are, there is, as you talked about before, there is supernatural evidence that you have experienced for yourself. Correct?
Yeah. I can't think of any real examples. I have a subjective experience of God that is very hard for me, and we've talked about this before. It's very hard for me to relate because of the personal custom and nature of it. I do think that I've seen God supernaturally and providentially bringing about things in my life, but it's difficult for me to relate that, and there's always it seems to be, there could be an alternative explanation. I'll be the first to admit that.
Well,
but,
no. Yeah. That's exactly what I mean. Is that you see things which can be explained. What I mean is you see things that could be explained naturalistically, but you can also, and you believe that there is also something supernatural going on at the same time.
Yeah, and that can be the case. It's just I see my fellow Christians just reading into things, which to me don't sound like there's anything special going on. And so now Christianity, Christian theism, biblical theology is going to set parameters around that to try to determine what would in fact be something providential or miraculous or direct intervention of God and things like that. And so you have some things there that can help you with that. But a lot of people say things like, well, the guy fell out of a window and it's a miracle that that bush was right there.
Yeah.
Well, that's not a miracle. That's not the definition of miracle. That may be providential, but it's not necessarily a miracle. And so we bandy about and use the word miracle.
But even something being providential involves something of the supernatural about it, right? I mean, there is a supernatural thread that goes through the concept of providence.
Let me give you a real quick example, and there's a book out from, I just completely blanked on his name, Mueller, I believe is who it is, who ran an orphanage, and very popular works from him. And he was running an orphanage in the beginning of the 19th century, and they were about to starve, it seemed. I mean, all these 100 kids were put to bed that night with no prospect for food in the morning. And the staff said, what are we going to do? And he said, gather the children this morning. It was morning already. Gather them together for breakfast. We're going to depend on God. And as he gathered them together and began to pray, there was a knock on the door, and a guy said, we have all this milk and we don't know what to do with it. It was on a train, and can you use it? And then a baker said, I've made too much bread. Somebody else knocked on the door and said, I've made too much bread, And some of this is day old. Would you like to have it? Can you use it here? If not, I'll throw it away. Well, they had this huge breakfast, and about 3 or 4 people come to the door. People say, it's a miracle. Well, it's not a miracle, first of all. That would be providence, because nothing in that violated a particular law of nature. And so it wouldn't fit the definition of miracle in the first place. But you can certainly, it's certainly plausible, and you can certainly suspect, especially if it's your worldview, that there's something divine going on here. There's some kind of superintendence beyond you, that is happening here. But
right.
I want to hasten to say, Zach, that I think one of the real interesting areas that we could talk about, if not this time, maybe another time, when there's conflict between science and religion, or is all the prayer studies that are done, and the attempts to quantify prayer, and that seems to be, wow, there's a good integration right there. There's something that we can maybe empirically test, and might point to something beyond, and but I think that, as you and I talked about one time, I think that those studies are problematic due to the very nature of prayer itself, and so on. So go.
Right. But what you're saying about providence is exactly sort of what I'm getting at, where this story that you told about the orphans and the breakfast, somebody who was looking at it completely atheistically, secularly, would say, well, it's a happy coincidence.
That's right.
And you would say, well, it's providential. And can we both sort of stand arm in arm and both think those diametrically opposed things, but still sort of appreciate the event for what it is, and not okay.
I think we could both smile, and you could look at me and say, "Wow, God really came through on that one, didn't He?" And I could laugh and say, was that not, or if it wasn't God, was that not one amazing coincidence?
Right. And, yeah. And
so we might have a big laugh. We might have a big laugh over it, but
And in areas of contention, contradiction, like the example of the Mormons with the Native American DNA, certainly a Mormon who wanted to be scientifically accurate would say, well, their DNA shows that they are not actually descended from the ancient Hebrews. However, could he still say, I believe that there is a spiritual connection between the Native Americans and the ancient Hebrews? I mean, is that not? That's what I'm kind of getting at. Is that not a way to approach things and maintain consistency in both the science and their faith?
It's a way out, but it's not very. I'll let the other guys talk, because
Laz, we haven't really heard much from Laz, so Laz, you need to speak up a little bit.
Okay, well, in other words, are you asking? Because what it seems that the Mormon just did in your example was he just sort of did something that was completely ad hoc. He went from saying that they're literally related to now they're just spiritually related.
Well, sure, it may not be the best logical approach to things, but I mean, is it a good way to maintain consistency with both his faith and also with the scientific evidence?
In other words, sort of like completely separating the spiritual from the natural?
Well, perhaps. I mean, it's very hard to. I mean, isn't the spiritual separated from the natural? I mean, for example, in Christianity and most of the Abrahamic faiths talk about the heart being the organ that thinks, and that's certainly a spiritual sense of the word, because we know that the heart doesn't actually think; it's the brain that thinks.
Right.
But in a spiritual sense, and they still, Jews, Christians, Muslims too, I guess, still talk about the heart. They still use that in language when they talk about when they fall in love, my heart feels like it's on fire about to burst, and when something goes wrong in a relationship, my heart's broken. Right. That's just sort of like a spiritual, a linguistic carryover from this from the spiritual sense about what actually takes place in the human body, even though we know that the heart actually pumps blood and is the center of the circulatory system, and when we're actually having feelings, they're happening in our brains. But Christians still feel comfortable, and other theists still feel comfortable about talking about the heart as a spiritual organ.
Right.
And is that the type of thing that, for example, the Mormon is doing when he's talking about, well, the Native Americans are still spiritually connected to the Lamanites in some way?
Yeah, I don't really see a big problem with that. I mean, I can often use phrases about the heart in that way. Many people do. It's not just Christians or Muslims or Jews.
Sure.
Yeah. I really don't see any problem with that. I mean, it's used as a metaphor, and as long as it's used as a metaphor and it isn't meant to be literally true, well, there's no real problem about that. The only problem that may arise is if your religious system turns out to be entirely metaphorical. At that point, simply your religious system is really just empty. It's really not saying much of anything. It's just completely metaphor, and that's what I think some Christian theologians have done that today. What they've done is they've taken all the central tenets of Christianity and they've turned them all into metaphors, and what's left over is basically this empty system that really isn't saying anything at all, and that was not original Christianity. So that's really where the only problem can come in. Of course, many theologians don't do that. It is predominantly the other way. Yeah, I don't really see any problem with referring to certain things in a metaphorical sense. That's consistent as far as I can see.
Okay. Well, it kind of sounds like we've made room for science and religion in the same room.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Einstein even made. You guys may recall what Einstein said. Science without religion. Do y'all remember that?
Science without religion. Religion without science is lame. Religion without science is blind.
Yeah, and he probably.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, he's probably also referring to even some of the moral underpinnings of science. Science assumes that experiments should be reported honestly, and that truth-telling is a moral virtue.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, peer review, very important to science, but that would entail taking moral high ground.
Yeah.
Assume do your experiments accurately, report honestly. Science, in the hard sciences, assumes that theories ought to be simple, they ought to be accurate, they ought to be predictably successful, and so on. And so they're actually putting a kind of a moral ought or a moral should. They should do this, and then, of course, the things that we accomplish from that are the fringe benefits in there. But I think that Einstein even saw that there's kind of a moral dimension to science, and once you start bringing up a moral dimension of science, you're talking about what I said at the first of the show, and that is that there's philosophy that undergirds the hard science.
That's actually an excellent segue, Kevin, because I think next week we should probably get into morality. So I think we've just about wrapped it up this time for science. I think we've done a pretty good job of finding some common space for religion and science to occupy. And next week we'll come back and talk about morality.
So let me just pop in this